Hi, everybody, and welcome to the 18th Inspiration Exchange. My name is Fergus Imrie, and I'm a postdoc in the Schaar Lab, and I'm going to be hosting today's session. I want to say a big welcome back to all of you who have joined us before for Inspiration Exchanges, but also a really warm welcome to those of you who this is the first time joining us today. As always, the ongoing aim of Inspiration Exchange is for us to share and explore the breadth of topics in machine learning for healthcare and generate ideas for future research. And today's topic is going to be a part 2 on causal deep learning. Just to give a brief overview of the format, so after a short intro by myself, I'm going to be passing over to one of our PhD students, Jeroen, who will give a tutorial and presentation on causal deep learning. We'll then go to one of our other PhD students, Boris van Breugel, who'll give a presentation on a cutting edge method for causal deep learning from our group. After this, we'll move to our roundtable discussion. And I'm delighted to say that we're joined by 3 industry leaders today, who I'll introduce in more detail later. After this roundtable discussion, we'll then open the floor to questions from the audience and open up the discussion. And so please do ask about this research area to both our presenters and our industry guests. For questions, please post your questions in the Inspiration Exchange channel on Slack. And as always, the earlier the better. If you don't have access to the Slack yet, please see the latest email on Inspiration Exchange for the link, and we'll also try and post it in the chat in the next minute or two. We then aim to wrap up the whole session by about 5 o'clock UK time. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker today, Jeroen Berrevoets, who will give a tutorial on causal deep learning. So as always, as I mentioned, please do post if you've got any questions for Jeroen in the Slack chat. Jeroen, if you're ready, please do share your screen.
Thank you, Fergus. So if you recall, we introduced causal deep learning in the Inspiration Exchange last time. So this is pretty much a part 2 of that. First, I want to recap a little bit what causal deep learning was and what we mean by this explicitly. So to do this, let's consider the ladder of causation one more time, which is a concept known or made known by Judea Pearl, where he categorizes each level of causality, where the lowest rung being association, then interventions, and then counterfactuals, where association is fairly easy to achieve and counterfactuals being very hard. So at the lowest rung, we can place deep learning, which is a very powerful and expressive tool, but sometimes it may be a bit too expressive. So there's no real way of exerting more knowledge into these systems other than through data. And then in the middle, we have interventions, which is the focus of most causality research. I mean, there is research in counterfactuals, but I would argue that interventions is more common. Causality is a very principled tool, but there are many assumptions underlying some of its ideas. So where does this place causal deep learning? Well, we understand that there is actually quite a big gap between interventions and association. So there's a lot of room in between these 2 rungs. Basically, this will be a guide to what we will discuss today for causal deep learning, with the lowest rung being let's improve association with causal deep learning, moving on to domain generalization, motivate some of the correct objectives we can achieve using causal deep learning, and interventions. And basically, these are the 2 endpoints, beginning and end point of causal deep learning. So this is where I would situate it. Now, to do this, let's discuss some preliminaries first on graphical models. So here's a fairly simple Bayesian network with only 3 variables, where A is leading to B and B to C. Now, from Bayesian networks, we know that this graphical model actually represents a distribution over A, B, and C, so one joint distribution. Now, there are many possible joint distributions you can imagine for this joint distribution, but with the graphical model, we can actually reduce the amount of possibilities fairly heavily. So it's a compact representation of a distribution. And beyond the distribution, we also have some additional information, being that A actually gives us no additional information for C when we know B, which is a fancy way of saying that A is independent of C given B. Now, if we consider this network as causal, we can actually do a bit more than just make some inferential statements. For example, if we intervene on B, we can actually mutilate this graph and come up with a new joint distribution, which is called the interventional distribution. So Bayesian networks, they give us structure, but causal graphs, they can give us some knowledge. And with causal deep learning, we want to use both of them. So let's start out with association, right? The lowest rung. We can ask, can we use structure such as a Bayesian network to improve supervised learning? So this would be, in my opinion, the simplest thing we can ask causal deep learning to help us with. And one way we can reduce hypothesis space, for example, is to do some regularization, where L2 and L1 regularization are probably the most easiest and well known. So L2 making the weights of a model fairly small, and L1 encouraging sparsity. So these are one-size-fits-all solutions, right? You can apply this to pretty much any model you can think of, but we can do more smart stuff than only these L1 and L2 norm regularization. So can we do something smarter? Yes, we can. Like L2 and L1, we can add a differentiable regularizer to our loss function, which looks like this. So it's a Hadamard product between the adjacency matrix of a graphical model. We take the exponent of this, the trace, and deduct the dimensions of the situation. Whenever this function equals 0, we say that A is actually a directed acyclic graph, just like the network we saw before. The cool thing about this is that this is completely differentiable in contrast to other score-based methods to identify DAG in data. So we can use this new regularizer to improve supervised learning by adding it to basically the input layers of a neural net, which is what we did in Causal. So Causal is a paper published by our lab at NeurIPS 2020, where we incorporate the DAG regularizer to a supervised learning model as a reconstruction-based regularizer. So what we did is you try to infer the data from itself using only the DAG. With the DAG, then you can reconstruct the adjacent features of this DAG, and what we have is a fairly constrained hypothesis space of your neural net, which improves the supervised task by quite a bit. So with Causal, you effectively reduce hypothesis space, resulting in a much more general model with great performance in the supervised domain. So that's pretty great. We can move one step further and say, okay, how can we use then causal deep learning for domain generalization? What we observe is that whenever we have an actual causal structure, it should remain constant over domains. Like a very good example would be two hospitals where you have a collection of data for a set of patients in hospital A and a set of data for a set of patients in hospital B. Whatever you find as the underlying physiology of patients, it should also be present in the other hospital, right? So the causal graph for hospital A should remain constant all the way through hospital B. And we can use this observation to come up with a better model for domain generalization also. So say you learn or you assume a DAG in domain A, we can actually learn a model that respects this DAG in some way and then have it apply to the target domain as well. And doing this will improve generalization quite a bit as you restrict it to a logical set of relationships given by this causal graph. There are a couple of papers from our lab that do exactly this, and I recommend reading them. They're very interesting. So the final point I want to make using this is the third point, is how can we use causal graphs to come up with a better objective to do deep learning with? So I'm going to do this by working out an example, specifically that of missing data in treatment effects. Now, we ask, should you impute missing data when estimating treatment effects, yes or no? And the thing is, this is quite an important problem because nearly all data has some missingness, right? Especially in tabular data. So what we observe is that sometimes missing data, as in a value that's not present in your data set, may cause treatment selection. So based on a value being missing, we may determine a treatment. And sometimes treatment may actually cause missingness. So there are these two conflicting phenomena happening with respect to missing data. The first one, as an example, so say you're transfusing blood, which is a very critical thing to do. Typically, you have to make a very quick decision, but you don't know the patient's blood type, so let's just give them blood type O, right? Because everyone can have this. If that's happening, then that means that not observing the blood type of a patient, missingness is deciding what type of treatment you're going to administer. And the second one is, say you have a certain treatment which requires you to do a blood test. Well, if you get that treatment, then the odds are much higher that you receive a blood test. You can always take a blood test, right? But if you don't take this treatment, then the odds are much less likely that you get this. So at this point, treatment is actually determining what you observe, and vice versa. Not being treated will cause you to have some missing values. So consider missingness as a binary vector of a bunch of ones and zeros, where 0 means the value is missing. Then using this observation, we can split this vector into two factors, right? Where one factor, Z out, which is the left one, says missingness is causing treatment. And the right one, where the arrow is going in, is called Z in. This means that missingness is caused by the treatment. Now we can structure this as a graphical model, which looks something a bit like this, where we have Y on the left side is the outcome, which is obviously caused by the covariates of the patient. And we can split the covariates of the patient according to their missingness as X tilde, which is the stuff that we observed that is causing treatment, and X in tilde, which is the stuff also that we observed, but where missingness is caused by the treatment. We can simplify this a bit because missingness and covariates they actually have a deterministic relationship. And what we observe is that there is this very tricky structure on the right side of this graphical model that says that X in is actually a collider between the treatment and the observed or the actual variables. So when we adjust for this, which is a typical thing in treatment effect estimation, we have to make sure that we should impute the X in tilde, but we cannot impute X out. And why is that? Well, if we adjust for the left and right side of X, even when they're imputed or not imputed, then we'll introduce bias, either by forgetting what is missing, which was causing treatment, or by adjusting for this collider structure. Now, this gives us something interesting, because if you adjust on the imputed set, which is the red node all the way on the right, this is still a child of a collider, right? So what this graphical structure tells us is that we should impute X in such a way that it becomes independent of W. So there's a multi-objective thing there, which is great for deep learning. So conditioning on the entire covariate set, either imputed or not imputed, introduces bias into the model. So with this, we actually defined an interesting objective using causality, where deep learning can help us achieve this objective, standard deep learning methods. We have an archive paper on this, which I would also advise to read. It's very cool. We also have, this is sort of a recap of what we have said on the research pillar on causal deep learning, which is online on our website. And what we've seen in this very short overview is we can improve association by doing Causal. So we regularize with a DAG learning objective. We have some domain generalization improvements using CAS and other methods, where we observe that a DAG is constant throughout different domains. And we can motivate a good objective for deep learning, which we did for missing data imputation. But what about interventions, right? So this is probably the crux of having causality in the first place. And this is where I basically hand it off to my colleague, Boris, where he'll discuss deep learning for with interventions.
Thanks, Jeroen. Boris, just before you do, let me introduce you very briefly. So the next speaker is going to be Boris van Breugel, who's another PhD student in our lab. And he's gonna give a presentation on decaf, generating fair synthetic data using causally aware generative networks. If you have any questions for Jeroen on the tutorial he just gave, or indeed on anything Boris is about to say, please do post them in the Slack chat. And really, the earlier is the better, in order to increase the chance that we have time to Time to ask your question to the presenters. So Boris, if you're ready, please do go ahead now.
Perfect. Thanks, Fergus. So I'll be talking about causal deep learning, but then for the purpose of synthetic data generation. So generating synthetic data using causally aware generative networks. So before we jump into this, let's briefly go into what is synthetic data again. And before we talk about synthetic data, let's talk about normal data. So if you talk about normal data, like healthcare data, it's impossible to share directly because, for example, there might be privacy concerns. So because of this, there are strict regulations in place, and in turn, this impedes the research we can do because it means that we have a lack of high quality healthcare data. So how do we solve this? There's two ways. So the first one, which is very popular historically, is to de-identify or to anonymize the data, which basically means you remove personal identifiers or you scramble some fields. Not great. The other option that we are much more interested in is synthetic data. So the idea is that you generate data from scratch that cannot be linked back to any individual, but that looks like real data. Of course, how do we actually do this? Well, that's not that easy. And is actually a machine learning problem in itself. So to be able to do machine learning better, to have more data, we actually need to solve this problem. So then why do we want synthetic data? So for one, for actually doing science and for developing analytics. So imagine that if you don't have data, you of course can't actually do anything. So for example, if you have synthetic data, you could share it with different research groups and that could promote more science. It could also facilitate reproducibility of, for example, clinical trials. Additionally, it might actually increase the robustness of models. Imagine a hospital that has their own data. Their model might be better if they also use data from other hospitals, even if it's synthetic. And a fourth application is to actually augment data sets. So some data set might not have a very good representation of some kinds of data. So for example, there might be rare diseases of which you only have a few samples. Can you then generate additional data for these classes of people? Similarly, there might be underrepresented patient subgroups. So can we generate additional data for this? These are just examples of augmentation. There's many more. And then one last application is to generate fair data based on unfair data, on which I'll talk later. So how do we then generate data causally? Well, it basically works fairly simple. We take a graph, which we assume is known. So for example, this DAG. Then we train a generative model based on the causal structure of the DAG. So in this case, I am taking a GAN model. And basically what we do is we take some noise. We train a GAN model for example, producing node A. And then the output of that node is passed to a second generator, for example, for node B, which is conditioned on both A and some additional noise. Well, similarly, C relies on B, and Y relies on A, B, C, and D. And we just follow this whole procedure and then use a discriminator as usual. Of course, this requires causal knowledge. But then when we've trained this generator, so if we know what normal data looks like, we can then also generate synthetic data with, for example, interventions by making changes to this graph. Or for example, by conditioning on a particular variable to say, well, we set B equal to a fixed value to generate, for example, additional data for this subgroup. So let's take an example, and I'm taking an example of fairness. So the problem with fairness is that real data might have unfairness in it, which then, if you use it for a prediction model, might lead to unfair predictions. A solution to this is to generate a synthetic data set. So we create a synthetic data set that is fair, so that then if we train a prediction model, we can then make fair predictions. How could we do this using a causal deep network? Well, we proposed DCAF, generating fair synthetic data using causally aware generative networks, which we presented at last NeurIPS. So the DCAF steps are quite similar as we saw before. So we train a generative model based on the causal structure of the data. Then we define which edges constitute to unacceptable bias. So, for example, assume A is for example, someone's salary, and we don't want Y to depend on salary. For example, the prediction on whether someone should get a particular medical procedure. We can say, well, these edges are actually unacceptable. We don't want them. Well, when we've already learned what the real data looks like, we can then remove the edges and generate synthetic data based on this augmented DAG. I'm not going to go into detail how DCAP works, but the main conclusion is that we can generate synthetic data using the causal knowledge we already have. And by doing this, we can actually create synthetic data with interventions or with local augmentation, for example, for fairness purposes. This was a very short presentation, but if you're interested in our work on synthetic data, we have a very extensive write-up on our site and also a tutorial at last ICMLs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Boris. Yeah, that was great. So now that we've had our two presentations, we're now going to move to the panel discussion portion of today's session. So I'd like to begin this by introducing our three industry guests today. The first is Dr. Amit Sharma, who is a principal researcher at Microsoft Research India. We're also joined by Dr. Cheng Zhang, who is also a principal researcher at Microsoft Research Cambridge. And our final industry guest today is Dr. Jim Weatherall, who is the Vice President of the Data Science and AI in the R&D department of AstraZeneca. Today's panel discussion is going to be chaired by Mihaela. And so I'd like to pass over to Mihaela to ask the first question of our panelists. If you do have any questions of the panelists during this, please do post them in the Slack channel, as there'll be time for questions after Mihaela's asked some questions to our panelists.
Thank you very much, Fergus. And thank you very much, Cheng, Amit, and Jim, for joining us today and making time in your very busy schedule to join us. So I prepared a few questions for you, hopefully to trigger a discussion with you and among you. So I'd like to start with the following question. In which settings and applications do you think that causal deep learning will be especially useful? And are there specific settings or applications where a causal approach may provide benefits compared to the standard deep learning approaches? And I'd like to start with Cheng, which I know has done great work in this area. And then I'd like to move to Amit.
Well, this is a great question. I mean, our team has been thinking a lot about it. And personally, I think the fundamental strength for causality is under the what if question. What will happen if I give treatment A or something like that? And I think this strength needs to be utilized to its ultimate scenario. And I feel in real life applications, I mean, think about traditional causality, scalability, flexibility, and all these things. These are really, limiting the use case. Although we have beautiful theory, but if the beautiful theory only works on three variables, real life application doesn't benefit from it. So in my mind, I think more like a really deep learning and causality combined together help to answer the what if questions, to help to make decisions, and really making some platform level tools that can be made for all decision making in sales, in medicine, in biology. So I think that's what I see the biggest potential in my mind.
Thank you. Amit, I know you have done also great work in this area. What is your thinking about this?
Yeah, I think I like to think of it what the goal of the task is. If it's often prediction and predicting how the world will be in the future, deep learning is great. But there are many problems where we are tempted to use deep learning, but they're actually decision-making problems. And I feel that's where causal deep learning or causal machine learning can help. Just to give a few examples, interestingly, like Cheng was saying, I think we've been thinking a lot about this ourselves. And what I find is these kinds of examples where decision-making is important often come from outside computer science where they're the most motivating. So let me give you two examples, one from medicine, where we all are aware of randomized trials, we all believed them. But the problem is you can only do it for one drug for a certain set of patients. But later on, you might want to combine drugs. You might want to have sort of different population on which you're giving the drug to. So this question of what would be the right prediction for a particular patient, given that there are these many options of drugs, would not be solved if you just would look at what has been done for past patients, right? We would need some understanding of how drugs work, how patients respond, and so on. And another example, which my colleague actually Emre Kaçaman is working on, is in agriculture. Like we have this question every time you sow seeds, especially in large farms, what is the right time to sow them? How much water should you put? And also questions of how you should do it such that you use the least amount of resources in the soil, right? And these are questions which somehow look like RL questions as well. You can always force them into sort of an explore-exploit trade-off. But I think what causal machine learning can help with is in reducing that sort of rollout that you need to do and using the domain knowledge to better guide these decisions.
Wow, so interesting. And actually, thank you for that. It kind of leads me to the next point that you kind of alluded to. So Fergus, if we can go to the next slide, which already the first two speakers said something about, but I aim this question at Jim because he's working in the industry. So what areas, Jim, do you think causal deep learning might have significant impact in the real world? Where do you think that we could use these technologies in the real world beyond what Amit already kind of has mentioned?
Yeah, thanks, Mihaela. And yeah, I think what the other two speakers said already gave us a good start on this topic, right? You know, things like treatment decisions, how can we, use counterfactuals to help to understand what might be the best way to take somebody's treatment. That's the sort of thing my team's always trying to think about. So maybe if I try to pick some other areas, I think when I think about my world, which is sort of understanding biomedical systems, I wonder how well we really understand them. I sometimes think, data science teams in biomedical organizations are basically correlation factories. You can kick out a lot of correlations, and then if some of them catch the interest of a scientist, if you're lucky, that might get backed up with a wet lab experiment that sort of elucidates what the underlying biology is actually doing. I see causal deep learning as a huge opportunity. I mean, there's tons of data. I don't think we've tried these techniques enough to really understand some of the underlying causal mechanisms behind disease. And that's what we're really trying to understand. You'd probably be surprised if I told you the number of medicines that are out there that have probably been out there many decades, and we've never actually got a full understanding of biologically how they work. We just sort of know they do because they make people better. So I sort of yearn for a data-driven, in silico way of gaining better understanding about biological mechanisms, which then allows organizations like ours to develop medicines that are very targeted because we know the mechanism we're trying to perturb or modify. So I think that's one huge area that could be massively impactful. And I think if you then combine that with the treatment decisions, once that medicine hits the real world, it could be incredibly powerful. Plus, there's just only so many wet lab experiments you can do, but there's loads of in silico experiments you can do with high performance computing capabilities and quantum computing coming around down the line. We should be able to do way more causality analysis on a computer than we can in a wet lab. Maybe just one more. I mean, I'm really interested in the work of the lab actually on imputation, Mihaela. And, again, there's lots of data often missing from biomedical and clinical data sets. And I think the way we try and impute that is too sort of limited to the data that has been observed. So actually being able to infer the medical causality behind a data set and understand those causal relationships and use that to impute data back, I think could give us some really, really strong data sets, particularly where we see lots and lots of missingness today, like patchy real world treatment pathways and things like that. So yeah, I think the future's bright for causal deep learning in medicine and biomedicine if we can get it right.
Thank you very much, Jim. Lots of challenges there and opportunities, I guess. Fergus, can you help me go to the next question I prepared? So causal deep learning currently relies on research from potential outcomes as well as graphical causality. Is this sufficient, or will new ideas be needed for causal deep learning? And I prepared this question for Amit, but Cheng and Jim, if you want to follow up afterwards, you are welcome as well.
Yeah, the short answer is that they're not sufficient. So back when I started in causality, I was very impressed by these two frameworks, because before that, all I had was data and cross-validation. So I thought, this is great. This is a whole new way to think about problems. But as we have done practical work, and especially with the open source do-while library, we get lots of requests from people, both in academia and industry. We've realized that at least the potential outcomes framework is mostly just useful at the second stage when you've already modeled what you want to estimate. But at the modeling stage, people face problems. The graph is just so much of a big thing to understand about a problem that almost any real world problem we've actually worked with personally as well, myself, it's hard to come up with a graph, and it's hard to come up with a graph you trust yourself. And there's benefits and sort of promise in causal discovery, but even there, I think, I'm not sure if we're asking the right question. If our goal was some decision to be made on a particular variable, and we are starting with, can I have the graph structure, please? Can you tell me how your world works before I make this single decision for you? So I don't think that graphs are the answer, especially I think in causal deep learning. We might be able to come up with more targeted ways of extracting just the domain knowledge we need to regularize our objective, right? If you think about it, at the end of the day, we just want deep learning to work, but just constrain the space of possible solutions. And it's unclear today what that might look like, right? 10, 15 years ago, I think graphs looked great because they were connected to probability distributions. You could do conditional probability on them. You could do many nice operations on them. But I think if the trend of deep learning, anything it has shown is that sometimes other techniques could work. So I'll just give one example in this direction. Think of contrastive learning. What if instead of a graph, we could just have simple principles that if we look at the image of the same person and we are doing person detection, the representation for these two images should be the same, right? And if we have this principle, and if we had data, enough data of this kind, we could use something as simple as contrastive learning to achieve the goals of causal learning. But yeah, I think honestly, I don't know what kinds of new frameworks will emerge, but I definitely think we need to think beyond graphs, because as anyone who's worked in practical problems, I think you would realize that it's a big hurdle. Actually, I would say it's something even stronger. It's a big hurdle for people to start doing causal learning, because these kinds of methods are the one that require graphs and assumptions, right? Who would start with that? So that's a big impediment as well.
Fantastic, Amit. Wow. I could not agree with you more. So wonderful to hear you say this.
Can I just add a little bit?
Yes, please.
I would say this question have two ways to look at it. One is whether graph is a good intermediate representation, because user want to make decisions. User have data, right? We don't have graph. Graph is an intermediate thing, but this intermediate thing is needed, right? That's one way to view it, right? Another way is, if it's not needed, what do we do? Do we infer it? I mean, there are causal discovery. Our team did actually. I mean, it was very helpful. Like we have drawing project. Let's do it end to end. maybe the internal black box still use graph, but we don't need user to provide the graph anymore. That's one solution, so that we can sidestep the problem. User need to provide the graph, right? Then another way of thinking about it is graph even needed as an intermediate representation. I think that aligns with what is talking about is contractive learning and all these things. And I think there's, graph is one way. It's more fundamentally rooted in the structural equation model. It's even constraints on structural equation model needed, right? So how do we capture like a real underlying system? I think that's a bigger question, right? How do we, because currently the assumptions, even causal inference start to assume graph, causal discovery start to assume functional form and distribution. This constrains us. No one like additive noise model with nonlinear function with Gaussian noise or something like that. That constrains us. If we completely think out of the box, we can have another descriptive language to maybe think about dynamic system or something like that. That can make all these things much more applicable. So I think these are the two ways I want to think about it. But in the end, we don't want the user to draw a graph. I think that is ultimately the goal.
Wow, fantastic. Wow, my neurons are excited now by what you all have said. Wow. Fergus, please, the next question. Wow. Okay, so, well, I guess kind of I asked this already, Cheng, so I'm not sure there are any causal deep learning which you have found interesting and useful. Maybe just a quick, if you can, answer, and then we could move to some other questions.
Yeah, I think I already answered a little bit. So in my organization, in my team, we focused very much on removing user to provide the graph. We are doing end-to-end causal inference where user only provides the data, and then we recommend decisions. So like this is something we're very proud of. There are a lot of work we need to do to improve the model. But internally, just want to say in Microsoft, we already have many internal application business partners already using the model. So we see the real world impact so that we can ask user to provide like tens thousands of data with 500 variables and directly make decisions. So these are what we enabled in Microsoft.
Yeah, very, very exciting work indeed. Fergus, the next one. So I guess this was also kind of mentioned. So maybe this time I'm going to turn more towards Jim to say what he thinks. When there is only partial knowledge of the true causal structure, how do you envision using this knowledge in tandem with the data? And I'll allow Jim to talk more about this because I think Cheng already alluded to that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think in general, it's a great opportunity for that kind of, synthesis of human and machine. I think, there's a lot of concern, isn't there, about, particularly by scientists, that I detect that as deep learning comes along and related techniques, it'll start making all their decisions for them and put them out of a job. I don't think that could be further from the truth. I sort of see the deep learning and particularly these partial causal structures as actually the best digital assistant a scientist can ever have, because it's going to help them overlay some known structures on the data and then a sort of appeal to them in a sort of two-way active learning paradigm, I guess, to say, well, help us fill in the blanks here, help us test out the hypotheses. We don't think this causal structure is quite right. And so then I've always thought that's how you get the best of both worlds, right? A machine can give you a lot of structure and insight from the data, and the humans need to give you an extra flash of inspiration from their knowledge that's a little bit more difficult to encode in that way. And so I think if causal deep learning can give us a way to synthesize that, I think it could be incredibly powerful. Or perhaps saying, okay, we accept this partial structure, the scientist now wants to test a hypothesis that there may also be a causal relationship between, with a link that we hadn't thought of before, or perhaps involving some latent data that we haven't measured. How can we go away and now test that in silico to see whether that's more or less likely? So I don't have a sort of specific method in mind, so others might be able to help me out with that, but I can instantly see how this is appealing in the scientific world and could massively augment the work of scientists.
Thank you, Jim. maybe Fergus, I think there is one more question I have, I think. So causal and deep learning often assumes that there is an underlying causal structure, and how realistic this is as an inductive bias and assumption, and do you think this matter for causal deep learning to be useful? I think both of you already kind of answered my question already. You kind of forecasted my question before. You probably built an internal model of me, but if you have anything to add, any of the three of you, this is our final question, so.
Maybe I can add to the previous question a little bit. I think it connects to this as well. One of my dreams has been like, if you start with a partial causal graph, the way we can approach it is that we need to fill this graph. So let's do the necessary experiments needed to know the edges that are missing. And that's how science should progress. And yet it does not happen that way. And the more I've talked to biologists and others, what I've realized is that it's not just the problem that they have a partial graph and they're just not adding to it. I think it's not even clear what the nodes of the graph should be. At what level should they start making this graph? And that's, I think, again, sort of comes back to at what level we would also want our representations to be, right? So now coming to your question at the end, let's take the classic DL tasks like image recognition or language generation. At what level should the graph be made? Should it be made at the level of tokens or pixels? Or should we first figure out a latent representation and have concepts that humans understand and have this anthropomorphic view that causal graphs should be made on the concepts that humans understand, because that's what we can do. So I don't know the answer, to be honest, but I think the very fact that it's so ambiguous raises a big question for us as a community, that if we have to think about starting with a graph for these high dimensional data like images, what is the right level? So that once I don't know, if I make a graph for ImageNet, it should be transferable to other settings as they come along. So maybe I'll just end with a question.
I think that they got me thinking now, Amit. I think that's a great point. And I've heard people refer to graph as kind of like, machine readable, machine interpretable data. I'm not sure it always lives up to that. I think we sometimes force fit them to be human interpretable, because you want to see nodes that you can identify as real objects, and maybe we need to start thinking beyond that. Like, how can the challenge I'd like to lay down is, how can a machine infer a graph where I'm completely flexible about what the edges are? It just needs to be the most sensible graph to achieve insight in the area which I'm interested. So maybe for me, the nodes don't need to be proteins and genes, and we don't really know what a gene is anyway. That's a flexible concept. So already we sort of force fit what we want a graph to represent. I wonder if you took those guardrails off, what would sort of free inference of graph construction look like? That would be really interesting.
Yeah, can I add a little bit to that? Because very similarly, we actually had a case in education. So I mean, the variable is more obvious in education than computer vision. You have questions, and then student can do. But then it's actually not interesting to learn a graph with a million questions, because graph is interpretable. But when it's come a graph with a million nodes, that's not interpretable anymore, and that's not what humans want, even it's defined. And then what we end doing is want to find the relationship between other topics, how the knowledge for one topic influences the other. And that actually leads to a collaboration with Oxford University Press, and they want to use that to inspire their expert to remake the whole program. But I think this is very similar, right? So what is the correct level of abstraction? We need certain level of abstraction for human to act on things and to think about things. But this is about the level and not about the graph itself. And I want to bring the second point that's maybe a little bit orthogonal. Is when we talk about we have partial knowledge of the graph, it's commonly from a domain expert. And where their knowledge come from? It's from either A/B testing or their partial knowledge. Actually, a lot of them don't agree with each other. So from our experience, we find 5 questionnaires, and these 5 experts will answer things differently. So we need to think about the interface on how to, if we have the partial knowledge, what is the best way for us to get that partial knowledge? Mathematically, we know how to construct a prior, but we cannot ask a medical doctor what's the prior, right? So this is something we cannot pose that question. I think interface-wise, I really want to think this is a huge, really, really important part to make the whole field successful. And another thing is sometimes when we think about, when we have the opportunity to do the test, to confirm an edge, people think about two ways. A researcher, we want A/B testing, so we want the result, this exists or not. But they say if I do a salesperson, they never want to lose a penny, they want the highest utility, and that's not A/B testing. How can we people to do something in between? How can we balance two objectives and people can say, we have very little risk for you to lose money, but we still get useful signals, can really get useful knowledge. And that's another direction we have been thinking, and to use the lowest cost to get as much information as possible for causality. So these are all very interesting questions like our team has been looking into.
Thank you so much, Amit, Cheng, and Jim. You mirror some of my thinking, but you also pushed my thinking so much further. So thank you so much for this. I think there'll be in the future a fefew questions to you from people in the audience, but let's take them one by one. So Fergus, I guess back to you.
Thanks, Mihaela, and wow, I just want to echo Mihaela's thanks and say another huge thank you to Amit, Cheng, and Jim. That was definitely fantastic. I now do want to open up for a general Q&A session for everyone who's here to ask questions of anybody that's spoken today. So we've got a number of questions already in the Slack channel, and we're going to just work through the questions we've got, and I'll ask you to unmute your question, ask you to unmute if your question is chosen, and then please do try and keep your question as succinct as possible, and then we'll give up for about 30 seconds, and then we'll give about 1 to 2 minutes for the answer of the question. So I think the first question we're going to take is from Jason. Jason, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So I'm asking regarding the second paper, the concept of fair data generation is intriguing, but the definition of fairness is quite subjective and cannot be perfect, right? So how do you define and understand fairness, especially in the healthcare setting? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I think that's a great question. You're absolutely right. Subjective is the key word in fairness. What we propose is a method that can take different definitions of fairness, right? And it not only depends on what you call fair, it also depends on what is the protected attribute. So, for example, might be age. For example, might be something protected in one setting, but in another it might not be a problem. In the healthcare setting, I think you need to think about, for example, why is a particular treatment given? You might say, well, you want a particular treatment to be given dependent on stuff that you know matters, but you don't want your advice to give a particular treatment to depend on, for example, ethnicity, if you know that ethnicity actually doesn't play a role. So in that case, it would be very wise, I think, to generate fair data based on that definition. But like you say, it really depends on the situation.
Thanks, Boris. I think the next question I'm going to take is also to you, Boris, and this is from Jean-Baptiste. Jean-Baptiste, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Boris your question?
Yes, thanks for the presentation. So I was wondering if you could generate synthetic data using decaf based only on literature knowledge or expert knowledge with no experimental data. Many thanks.
Yes, you could. I think it would be less interesting. In that sense, it would more return to classical synthetic data, in which really you just have a model, so it would just be more modeling. Of course, there is a middle ground here where you could say, well, maybe you know one kind of mechanism for which you know the features, but another one you don't, but you do have data for that. So, for example, decaf would allow to define some of the relationships in terms of known expert equations, but then generate other things using your data set. And that is an interesting combination, I think, that we haven't really explored.
Thanks, Boris. I now want to take a question, I think for Jeroen, from Harry about missing value imputation. Harry, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes. So my question is, have you guys applied these methods to the RNA-seq, the single cell sequence data? Because there are a lot of missing values, but the missingness could be like there's a lot of zeros. The zeros could be caused by biological reason, also could be caused by the sequence technology problem. So this is just my question. Yeah.
So we haven't applied this to a genomics data set. Let me start with that. But the thing is, with MCM, what we propose is that you should think very carefully when imputing data, right? We don't necessarily introduce a method to impute. It's just we define an objective based on a causal graph. And the thing with genetic data is there's no real treatment that can interact with how missingness may manifest. However, the same principles that we use to derive MCM, I guess you could also apply to the genomics domain, where you may know of some causes that let some values be missing, for example, and some you don't. So this is where I think taking the causal deep learning approach, where you first define the graph that is causing missingness, and then based on this graph, you come up with a good strategy to impute or not impute your data, I think would be very valuable also in RNA-seq data.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeroen. I think the next question is also going to be for Jeroen from Elizabeth. Elizabeth, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question on data imbalance?
Yes, thank you. So my question is about data imbalance indeed. So I was trying to relate this unfairness question to another bias situation in deep learning where every class is not represented in the same amount in your data set. So could causal deep learning also provide sort of fairness ways to create fairness in that way, or is this something that needs to be addressed in another way?
So yes, I think so. Yes. So when you have class imbalances, is an artifact of the distribution of your data, right? And what you do with causality is you're being very explicit about what the structure is of your data. Can you manipulate it in some way? And then using this new structure, can you, in the case of decaf, for example, sample new data according to the new structure? And this, I think, could definitely be used to do some class rebalancing, let's call it. So this is just one type of bias that I think causal deep learning can help with.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Jeroen. The next question I want to take is for our panelists and is from Marta. Marta, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, and then whoever wants to jump in from our guests, I think please do feel free to do so.
I was just wondering thanks for a very interesting discussion. I was wondering if you could comment on the pros and cons of the causal approach when compared to more classical physics-based simulations. In particular, there's a lot of hype around physics-informed neural networks that take the laws of physics as the regularizer in effect. So I was wondering if you could comment on the pros and cons and applicability of both. Thank you.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Cheng. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, this is based on interpretation. So for me, what causality do is finding the real underlying true process, and the physics process is one of the true underlying process. So in a way that if you have a clear this simulation based in some way is the full structure equation model. So that is you can interpret it as a causal system. But that's a special causal system in some way. And for general causality, I think we're dealing with things where this true causal system in a way, like this physics world, like the whole simulation, right? The whole generation dynamic, we don't know. And that's the part I think the research is focusing on.
Yeah, I was just going to build on that, Cheng, and I think, yeah, it sort of depends how much you already know. So for instance, we use physics-based simulations to understand whether a molecule is going to be able to dock into a protein, which is what we want a therapeutic medicine to do. And if we already understand pretty well the structure of that molecule and the structure of the protein, we can use physics to sort of estimate the optimal free energy, and it helps us to tweak the design of the molecule and things like that. So if you sort of know, for us, if you know enough about the biological structure, you can probably rely on physics-based techniques. If we're probably more in, on a weaker hypothesis, or maybe we don't even have a hypothesis and we're trying to learn something from the data, then I think causal DL could be much more informative for us. So probably depends on the task.
Thank you so much. And so thank you to all of our speakers for taking questions, and to all of our guests as well. I think in the interest of time now, we're not going to have time for any more questions, but we'll try and answer as many as we can in the Slack channel after the session. So if you did ask a question, please do check there, and hopefully we'll be able to answer the ones we missed. There's just a couple of small housekeeping things before we wrap up. The first is We Create. Mihaela, do you want to say a couple of words about this?
Yes. So I wanted to advertise another engagement session, which is not happening every month like Inspiration Exchange, but it's happened every so often, and this is our second session. This session is aimed at women, really, and trying to build a community where we would like to encourage everyone, but mainly women, to consider engineering, computer science, applied math as an area in which they devote their work and their ambition. And we want to highlight how an exciting area this is for women to be thinking about when considering careers or when they are considering changing careers. And in this session, which we are going to have on June the 8th, I'm going to be joined by Cheng Zhang, who is here today with us in Inspiration Exchange, but also two other women from academia at different stages of their career. And we would like to talk to everyone that's interested, women, but also men, about the exciting area of computer science, engineering, applied math, and hopefully have many of you who are unconvinced or people who are new to the area to join this creative effort.
Thank you, Mihaela. So just finally, before we wrap up, I wanted to give a few little details about our next session. So the 19th Inspiration Exchange will take place on June 21st, and will be a preview of some of our lab's work that will be presented at the upcoming ICML conference. Thanks for everyone who's been able to join us today. If you do want to stay up to date, please do visit our dedicated page for Inspiration Exchange. And if you have any colleagues or friends that you think would be interested in our sessions, please do refer them to both this page and then our video on YouTube that will be up soon. Finally, I'd just like to say a massive thank you once again to all of our speakers today, all of our industry guests, and to everyone who was able to join us. Thank you very much, and goodbye.